This is Sirens, a new series brought to you by the Ladies of Bombshell, where we dissect the institutions of American power. Join us as we sound the alarm on technology, governance, and national security issues. Sometimes lure some men to their deaths, and sometimes just talk about it. I'm Lauren DeYoung-Shulman.
I'm Rada Iyengar-Plum.
And Rada and I have both been in and out of hotels recently for just work travel and things like that. Also fun travel, but work travel too. And this question came up because Rada texted me one time this meal that she was having at some point, and it was just like this perfect hotel meal. So my question is, what is your favorite or preferred room service meal?
So two things to know are the thing I love to do is order a large bowl of French fries and a large glass of a dry white wine which pair excellently together. And I will have them routinely by myself as my, hotel version of girl dinner, I guess.
Yeah.
And sometimes if I'm feeling particularly peckish, I might add to that a hamburger.
Yeah.
So that is and you could sit it in, if you're in a hotel that has a good robe, you can wear the hotel robe and you can get your messy food, and it's just very satisfying.
I am very similar. My favorite is a Caesar salad and a medium rare hamburger. Sometimes French fries, depends on how hungry I am, and always a ridiculously large glass of wine. I attempted to do so. I didn't do exactly that, but the hotel I was at this week, I was attempting to set up my laptop, drink an old fashioned, and do some work. And there were various people around that I knew, but they were also chatting off to the side. And they were just baffled that I just wanted to sit at a bar by myself, having a drink and do work. No, this is incredible. I wasn't doing it at 3 p.m. It was 6. This is great. This is the preferred way to get business done. And they just did not understand.
They're doing it wrong. I love to do that. A nice Manhattan, a quiet bar corner.
Yep.
Everything you could want.
Yep. Well, we have a lot going on this week, and we're not even going to get to some of the main things that are happening this week, but we will cover some of the key issues. So let's see. I'm gonna start with FISA Section 702, which you probably, if you were alive and paying attention to the news during the Edward Snowden era, this would have been a very much on your mind. But otherwise, just one of those things, this gift that comes back every once in a while when you have to re-extend it or reauthorize it in some way. So anyway, Section 702. It lets intel agencies intercept communications from foreign nationals abroad. And those foreign nationals, they talk to Americans sometimes. And therefore, a whole lot of American communications can get swept up in that. And it ends up being super controversial because people are like, oh my gosh, I don't want the intelligence community to listen to Americans. That would be bad and sometimes illegal. So at the moment, because it is very controversial, some people don't like it, and some people say that there's illegal things about it. It is just on a 45-day extension. So not a 3-year extension. It's on 45 days, which, that's totally fine. There's a whole lot going on in this space that makes it even harder. And I'm going to mention 3 of them, but there's honestly, there's endless in this space. One is that someone recently, our friends in FISA court, which that would be such a cool job, found that there were some compliance problems in how the administration was running the program. And
this is my shocked face.
Yes, total shocked. And to be fair, this is not, they have found such things before. This is not a uniquely Trump thing, but anyway, yes, shocked face for sure. The administration is considering appealing the ruling so that they don't have to fix it. Number 2 is that there is I love this, secret legal interpretation of Section 702. And the fact that we can have secret legal interpretations and secret law, just crazy, that multiple administrations have relied on. And Senator Wyden has been trying to make a really big deal about this for it to be declassified. He's been on this for a long time. Senator Wyden is a fairly reliable opponent of things related to this topic. And DNI, no surprise, refused. And last but not least that I'm going to mention right now, a 2024 reform that sounded fine at the time required the FBI deputy director to approve sensitive searches of folks like elected officials or journalists. And, that's cool. But then for a while, and folks may remember this, the deputy director of the FBI was Dan Bongino, who, he's not now, that I should note, but he was for a while. So I just don't really trust him. So Wyden, and I quote, I love this, any senator who votes to reauthorize this law without real reform will be directly responsible when the Trump team abuses their spying powers to go after Americans. Very dramatic. He also highlights things like The 702 database was searched to find Black Lives Matter protesters, political campaign donors, elected officials, state judge. Not awesome. And then what's interesting right now with all of that mess, there's not a great coalition that is actually going to try to make this happen. Usually can reliably go to certain folks to be like for or against in very clean ways. We don't have that cleanness right now. One is that Trump himself was formerly not really a big fan because it was used to surveil his campaign. And he is now, interestingly, demanding a clean extension because the surveillance powers work for him now. Libertarian and Republicans, they are always fairly reliable. You're like, nope, they're still blocking it. And Democrats are split. And because some are like good governance folks and they want reform and they're willing to, who want to see this get better. Some are willing to hold their nose and pass a clean extension because we are at war with Iran. Kind of awkward if we can't actually listen to anything going on in that space. So TLDR, we have FISA on a 45-day patch, which is a totally normal way to run a national security program.
Look forward to discussing this again in 3 episodes.
It'll be great. Okay, Radha, do we have another pandemic? What's going on?
So yeah, hantavirus. It's a virus and it's on a cruise ship in the Atlantic. And if I had a really visceral reaction to the words outbreak and cruise ship, in which I was like PTSD flashback to the Diamond Princess in February of 2020, which folks will remember was a cruise ship that had all the COVID victims on it, COVID folks on it early in our COVID saga. So here's the basic deal. There was this Dutch expedition ship that left Argentina at the beginning of April, as one does, with about 150 people on it, a range of nationalities, including a bunch of Americans, a bunch of Brits. And at some point in early April, passengers started getting sick. They had fever, they had GI symptoms, and then they had this rapid progression to pneumonia and shock. Now, the WHO gets notified May 2nd, which you'll notice is a couple weeks later. And then on May 6th, the virus is confirmed as this Andes virus, which is the one kind of hantavirus known to do person-to-person transmission. So there are about 3 deaths so far. The cases are now hospitalized worldwide: South Africa, Spain, Germany, the Netherlands, Switzerland, St. Helena. And CDC sent a team out on May 7th to get the Americans, 17 of them, repatriate them to a specialized facility in Nebraska. One is tested positive. I believe the British military paratroopered some medical equipment in to another location. So it's a very exciting and dramatic turn of events. But a couple of things just to note here. One, it's scary sounding, but the fatality rate is about 38%. There's no specific treatment, only supportive care if you can get it fast enough. So that's what makes this scary. The flip side is this is the kind of multi-jurisdictional public health event that the international regulations that we passed after COVID, were meant for, and it kind of worked. Like the UK notified WHO within hours. South Africa did this PCR confirmation. Spain hosted disembarkation. There's been, this as compared to when back in 2020, we spent weeks arguing about whether WHO had been told and whether China reported in time. And, so we've actually delivered some changes. Now, the downside is it's not like we're really super strong institutions here in the United States at HHS, CDC, and now actually the FDA deputy director was just let go for not approving, I think, flavored e-cigarettes. Oh. So, it's just not a great time for the medical community and medical institutions inside the U.S. And we know that you can't really surge that kind of capability. So I think the big picture is global risk is probably pretty low. The CDC says the risk to the U.S. public is extremely low. This virus really does need sustained contact, so this is not a COVID. But, the boring infrastructure matters, and you only notice it when it breaks is an important takeaway here, because it's broken right now, and we probably need to fix it.
There's so many things that are striking about this, but the one that this is bizarre that it occurs to me the most is we have a specialized facility in Nebraska.
Yeah.
Why Nebraska? Part of me is is that because it's the middle of the country, not many people live there? It is almost certainly not that, but wow.
I assume it's because it involved a large federal investment, and there was a Nebraska senator who was on the appropriations committee, and that's how it got there. But I'm just spitballing.
Yeah. I mean, that's usually how most of these decisions are made. Well, I appreciate that we're in a slightly better institutional place than we were in 2020, but still, and don't love the idea of new viruses floating around. Okay, next up on It's a Drill is, it just feels like the Obama administration and any number of parts of the first Trump administration all over again, because last week, the Pentagon, 2 weeks ago, whenever this was, the Pentagon announced that it is going to be withdrawing 5,000 troops, etc., from Germany over the next 6 to 12 months. The official explanation is that a thorough review of the department's force posture in Europe has occurred, and therefore they're going to do this. I think most people are actually believing that it's the German chancellor who said that the United States was being humiliated by the Iran negotiators and had no strategic plan, which is true. Trump responded by calling him totally ineffective, and then he announced this troop pool. So these are what's interesting here is these aren't, as far as we can tell, they're not the permanently stationed forces, they're the rotational forces that had been there as part of a Biden-era Ukraine surge. They're not the permanently based units that have been there for a long time. That would require uprooting a whole many more thousands of troops and families and all kinds of other stuff. Reducing rotational forces in Europe as part of an Indo-Pacific pivot has been on planners' minds for a long time. The fact that they're doing this isn't enormously surprising. And I should note that during the Obama administration, they did some very similar moves. I remember getting to tell our European colleagues about that, and they were thrilled. What is alarming is that this feels like, even though they said there was a review, everyone's pretty skeptical about this, and it seemed like it was instead Trump just immediately reacting to a statement with a truth or a tweet or whatever. Because usually this kind of thing takes forever, and you actually announce it in very polite, sequenced ways. We may not do that anymore, but this kind of seems like it was just Trump getting pissed off and doing a tweet, and therefore that's how we do force posture these days, which maybe, honestly, it's not the end of the world. It was also interesting to me is that this is on a bipartisan basis. Folks on the Hill are pretty unhappy about it, to include the Republican chairman of both armed services committees saying that they were very concerned, which usually stands for they might actually do something about it. But who knows? Because Germany has, frankly, been interestingly stepping up in a lot of ways, to include increasing its GDP spend on defense and providing, with some hesitation, some access around operations. So more to follow on that as we see if it actually happens. I am skeptical, but we shall see.
I will say that the German reaction, though they probably wouldn't characterize it, felt like a very Gallic shrug, like Trump will be Trump approach. So I agree. I don't think anyone believes there is a thorough review underpinning this, but also it may be much of a muchness. But sticking with the European theme, and maybe for once to try to have a positive note here in our dumpster fire section, on April 12th, Viktor Orban lost an election after 16 years to a guy named Peter Magyar and the opposition party, which took nearly 70% of seats in the Hungarian parliament. So they have a supermajority. And I think the key here is Orban was basically the prototype of this illiberal, anti-democratic playbook with gerrymandered districts, captured media, captured judiciary, friendly oligarchs and rich businesses, and basically had a lot of I won every election kind of energy, with a Hungarian system that is really intended to favor, or really is structured to favor incumbents. So you can win districts with 30 to 40% and still get majorities and supermajorities. And so Orban lost anyway. And this is a range of great quotes from this, but Magyar's own words are that it was a victory visible from the moon and every window in Hungary, which, I mean, is a great line. And the European Commission president was tweeted, Hungary has chosen Europe, which is, I mean, it's like a warm and fuzzy feeling all around. So there you go. Democracy. It happens sometimes.
I've learned some fun facts about, first of all, we're probably butchering the pronunciation of his name.
Yes, sorry.
But because I have no other way to say this, but it is clearly not Magyar. It's something else. But obviously I do not speak Hungarian, but generally that name is the equivalent of being named Captain America in the United States, which fantastic name. So like the whole thing is just like clearly the writer's room did very well this season. Some of the other fun facts is like that there's a lot of just incredible populist moments in this campaign, to include a drone being hired to overfly a relative of Orban's who had a zebra farm basically on his property, so while people are struggling with like paying rent or fuel and other things like that, so he had like a literal zebra farm, which is amazing. And the counterweight to that being, they did this incredible social media campaign about how state-run hospitals and other facilities are not getting the support they needed, to include toilet paper. A children's hospital was not getting toilet paper, so they would basically go around and bring and volunteer and deliver toilet paper to these various state facilities. And it just became this whole big social media memification. There's obviously many more things going on in this, but the social media elements of this were fantastic. So anyway, yes, it's very nice to put out a dumpster fire. Before we go into a new dumpster fire, which is, believe it or not, Russia and Ukraine are still a thing, and things are still going on here. There is a lot to talk about because the picture has shifted in some interesting ways in the past couple of weeks. I know we say that frequently, but we really mean it this time. The war is now in year 5. And the headline that is kind of surprising is that the battlefield has gone from static to kind of sort of favorable of Ukraine in the last month, which is particularly notable given all of the drama with the United States and its support to Ukraine over the last year or so. Russia has lost 46 square miles of territory in the 4 weeks ending on May 5th. That's about double the size of Manhattan. So Ukraine, as a reminder, is large. The month before that, they had netted gains of another 17 square miles. Zoom out over a year, Russia took about a lot of square miles, 1,700, which sounds like a lot until you realize that it's 0.7% of Ukraine's pre-1991 territory. So glacial, very attritional, and now kind of starting to go backwards. Unknown why. Well, we'll explore why. Casualty estimates from that time period over the last few weeks are roughly 1 million Russians killed. And wounded. 200. Sorry, this do not from the last few weeks. These casualties are not from the last weeks. They came out over the last few weeks. And then, as opposed to about 250 to 300,000 on the Ukrainian side. So that is definitely real, but it's also deeply asymmetric in terms of how we're seeing those casualty rates be impacted. Here's the thing: the military stalemate is running concurrent with an energy and humanitarian collapse inside Ukraine, which is not great. And that is that's the part of making any deal, more attractive to the Ukrainians that would have been 6 months ago, as they are still seeing some military changes on the ground. So that was a whole lot of catch up, but I actually do want to take an even bigger moment to talk about how we got here and what it may mean for where we are in this potential opening of an opportunity going forward. So Radha, how do we get here?
Yeah, so you're right. 5 years ago, in February 2022, hard to believe that's almost 5 years ago, Russia launched this full-scale invasion. Kyiv doesn't fall in 72 hours like everyone else predicted. Ukraine holds. Then the U.S. from 22 to 24 is a huge backer with European allies, providing military, economic, and humanitarian aid. Sweden and Finland join NATO. Europe starts maybe kind of waking up on defense spending, see aforementioned Germany. And then in 2024, Trump runs on explicitly ending the war, famously saying he'll do it in 24 hours before he even takes office. He picks a fight with Zelensky in the Oval Office. The whole Ukraine question becomes a proxy for this MAGA versus the more mainstream Republicans fight. And then in 2025, turns out that ending a land war between Russia and Ukraine, a country fighting for its own existence, is not actually a day one deliverable. And so you get this long drawn out Trump cycles with Putin on wanting peace. Zelensky's a problem. Then Russia's a paper tiger, and back and forth. Trump even sends out Jared Kushner. Remember that? To do
Aw.
back channel negotiations. And that brings us to December 2025. So just before Christmas last year, where Trump just declares that we're going to get to a peace treaty.
You know, sometimes you just have to manifest things. Bring that, say it, look in the mirror, say positive things. All right, so we've got Trump Zelensky, interesting dynamic. We have Trump Putin, which if you've seen videos of Putin lately, it looks like he's in a troubled spot. And Trump Europe, all its own very separate set of relationship drama. What has been happening in the last couple of months since we checked in, since that declaration?
Okay, so Trump and Zelensky basically met on this 20-point peace framework. Side note, peace frameworks always have like a lot of points. Just feel like, so Zelensky comes out saying they're 90% agreed, security guarantees, like with NATO-like protections. And the unresolved 10% is the thing it has literally always been, which is territory, which is what the war is actually over. So Zelensky, he's in Mar-a-Lago. They agree to these guarantees, or almost agree to them, kind of agree to them. And the idea is that Trump is floating these ideas of free economic zones in the Donbass, and Zelensky basically reminds everyone that these territorial decisions are going to have to be ratified by Ukrainian voters. And then you get to Russia, whose position is that they want the entire Donbass and they're not going to do anything else. There's no deal unless that. And so then we get into January, and Trump basically blames Zelensky for stalling, says Putin is ready when you are, and Zelensky pushes back. And now you have Trump setting a June deadline, and Zelensky saying he'll do everything to end the war. These talks that continue from March into April, until finally Trump announces a 3-day ceasefire during Victory Day, because just remember that Russia actually fought on our side in World War II. So it's like super awkward, right? We're all having VE Day, and here we are. Anyway, so now we're in this slightly weird ceasefire, which, side note, Zelensky issued a presidential decree theatrically authorizing Russia to hold a parade for Victory Day, which I thought was a pretty good time.
That's great.
So Zelensky is leaning into this Trump process, and he's accepting this trilateral track, and he's accepting this June timeline, but there hasn't actually been any agreements on security guarantees, economic zones, territories, any of this stuff. So that's kind of where we are in the story. We've agreed to a process and possibly a deadline-ish.
Just as an aside, something that occurs to me every time I see Zelensky on television or just see a photo of him is to wonder, like, does he get a vacation? I know he probably would not publicize I'm taking a vacation, but like, has he managed to like eke out like the equivalent of an Airbnb stay in the last like several years? The answer is probably no. So I'm really hoping that at some point in time, the man gets to actually take a break. Putin and his Victory Day press conference, which the parade was maybe slightly lesser than it usually is because they were possibly worried about drone attacks. What do you make of what he said, and also how he looked, which is kind of freaky? But in more particularly, what did he say? Where does this leave us right now?
Yeah, so I think on the one hand, Putin said for the first time ever about the war, I think the matter is coming to an end, which suggests he feels like the war is winding down. And the man looks like he's ready for a war to wind down.
Yep.
I think we can all be honest. Like, this time and war has not been kind to Putin. But like, he's got this, what I'll call the Minsk II playbook, where he's basically being really flexible on process. He agreed to a ceasefire, a POW swap, and absolutely rigid on any substance. No territory agreements, no security zone, no leader level negotiations. They only want to meet to sign it and move on. And so, he's said he'll meet Zelensky anywhere in any third country, but only as a signing ceremony. No negotiation, because there's no point. I think I don't think that there's any progress on the key element of territory, because Putin has reiterated that Russia needs a buffer of unspecified depth, so no one threatens it. And it's basically his way of saying they want to keep all these annexed oblasts and get the Donbass. And probably a little more.
So I want to, we talked earlier about Germany, but I want to get your take on how the Europeans are reacting in this moment. Not just in terms of, I think there's obviously multiple elements here, but like some of it is their views on whether or not that for the Ukrainians. But there's also like very significant security implications for themselves, both in terms of like how they have engaged in this conflict over the last several years, but also into their long-term security status here. So how are our friends, the Europeans, reacting?
I mean, on the plus side or on the leaning inside, the EU finalized this 90 billion euro loan after the Hungarian Orban lost his election and lifted his veto. And the repayment from Ukraine is really only triggered if Russia pays war repatriations, which I don't even think is a serious part of the negotiations here. So it's basically a grant dressed as a loan. But the Europeans, so that's, positive, and they've leaned in. I will note that, though, a bunch of the rhetoric and the language in the grant requires things like made in Europe provisions, which means that the defense money has to go back to European producers. And this has been a topic of conversation actually back into time, which means that there are dollars flowing in for Ukraine, and that is probably not going anywhere near the U.S. defense industry, which is probably good for European capacity, but bad for the U.S. defense industrial base. And so I think basically Europe is willing to underwrite Ukraine financially with or without the U.S. and looking to build its defense industrial base while doing it, which maybe will be good, again, for European cohesion and strength, but probably not great for the U.S., especially, as you noted, in the context of the German troop pullback, the fighting with everyone from Spain to Italy to Germany on a variety of things related to the military excursion in Iran. And so, I think the big risk here is this decoupling of our typical posture with Europe in a timeline that runs parallel to this peace negotiation and really sets up a Europe versus Russia dynamic without the shadow of the U.S. hanging over, menacing shadow to back up Europe in this context. So,
okay. So last couple of points. June it's literally the middle of May, which I disagree with, but June's coming. What should we be looking for as deal talk ramps up or doesn't?
I mean, I'm going to be amazed if a deal lands given everything else that's going on. But I think the thing to watch out for is the gap between the process and the substance. I think we've seen a number of times before in this administration in particular, a lot of announcements on victories and conclusions that don't really align to the reality on the ground. And so even if Trump lands a air quotes successful deal, I think you'll want to look for what has Ukraine actually agreed to, what has Europe agreed to, what is actually being executed in terms of troop movements, and where does that leave the Europe and sort of U.S. allies at the end of the day. And I suspect there's going to be a big gap there.
Well, I suspect this is definitely not the last time that we're talking about Russia, Ukraine. We shall return to this topic again soon and move on to warning signs. So this week for warning signs, we have a special guest who, if you want to understand what's actually happening in Congress right now, not just like the nonsense that's in the headlines, some of the gossip we're talking about during It's a Drill, but really in the machinery that's underneath it, we have no better guide than our next guest, Molly Reynolds, who is the Vice President and Director of the Governance Studies Program at Brookings. She has covered the gamut of everything from congressional rules and procedure and how that shapes outcomes. She literally wrote a book on exceptions to the rule, the politics of filibuster limitations in the U.S. Senate, which sound like all of those words together may be like, how's that interesting? That is so interesting, and it's so valuable to the conversation we want to have today. particularly as it relates to issues around reconciliation and other filibuster bypassing procedures and things like that were created, how they've been used, and some of the not so awesome consequences. She also oversees this really awesome project called the Vital Statistics on Congress project that has all kinds of amazing data around what we know about Congress, how well they're functioning, or realistically how not well they're functioning. We'll talk more about that in a second. She's, in short, she has the receipts. So we're so delighted to have you here today. Welcome, Molly.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So I actually want to start with this vital statistics question because anytime I have a moment like I'm writing something, I think, what's going on in terms of like how oversight's going or things like that, I turn to this resource. And it not only has interesting data on it, but the trends that you guys unlock are, I want to say awesome, but frankly more disturbing is usually the word, but awesome will probably precede it. Can you just tell us a little bit more about this project and what are some trends that you think that might surprise people?
Yeah, so VitalStats has been around for a long time. It's actually older than I am. You can then make whatever guesses you want about how old I am based on that, but it is older than I am. It actually started as physical books, and if you ever come see me in my office, I will show them to you. But now it's all online, it's all free. And the real goal originally of the project was to collect and make all this data available in a time when you couldn't just sort of go on the internet and go to the clerk of the House's website and see how many times did the House vote in a given Congress. Like all that data was much more difficult to get. And part of its power is in just how long the time period it covers. One of my favorite things about it is that at really any moment in time, as you were suggesting, Lord, it speaks to something that's happening in the world. So one table I've gotten a lot of phone calls about in the last several months is the one about congressional retirement. And so I can tell you, because we've been collecting this data for so long, is that we are at a sort of recent historical high mark this year for congressional retirements. I think that tells us some really important things, both about what Republicans and the current majority believe about their electoral prospects for the fall. It also tells us just as much about the fact that I think a lot of people just really don't enjoy being members of Congress right now. A lot of, particularly the Republicans who are leaving this year, are running for other office. So it's not that they are retiring entirely, going to either actually or metaphorically spend more time with their families. They're not cashing out for K Street. They are choosing to run for governor or senator or any number of other things. So they're trying to stay in public service. And I think that tells us that the data, so we can see that this is a high mark, really helps anchor an explanation about some important things about the institution.
I had no idea on that they are going to run for other offices point, because I think my automatic assumption would have been, no matter what they're saying, it's they're going to go cash out in some way. But like, that is so telling. Wow, I want to sit with that. So my next question is the one that relates to one of the main reasons we wanted to have you on, and that is around reconciliation, which as a term sounds sort of warm and fuzzy. And I guess it is kind of warm and fuzzy, but I first am going to ask you, just going to help define, like, what is this? If you've been paying at all attention to things going on in the shutdown debate and how we eventually reopened parts of DHS, you've heard this. And if you are a defense budget nerd like Rada is, you probably understand a lot of the ins and outs of this. But it's one of those things where it's not necessarily intuitive, or maybe it's too intuitive. It was designed as a budget tool. I want to hear more about how it became something that is maybe a bit more than a budget tool, and in particular, what the last year represents in terms of how far it's gone from what we might have thought of as the original purpose.
Absolutely. So reconciliation, you're totally correct that it has this sort of like very positive connotation. The way that the process got its name actually comes from the use of the word reconciliation in an accounting sense. So in the idea that you might have to reconcile two sets of numbers to one another. And it originally developed as part of the 1974 Budget Act for a really different purpose. So in 1974, Congress envisioned its preparation of its budget annually with kind of one resolution in the spring that would set out an initial set of targets. Then they would do a bunch of appropriating and other lawmaking during the course of the summer. And then just before the new fiscal year started on October 1, they might need to come back and make some other changes really quickly to bring everything kind of in line with one another, to reconcile.
Oh, that sounds like such a nice good governance thing.
Such a lovely idea. I will say that, like, the process never actually worked in the way that it was intended to from those steps as laid out in 1974. But because they thought that they might ever need to act really quickly just before the start of the new fiscal year, they wrote into the law this option for moving certain budgetary legislation without the threat of a filibuster in the Senate. So they said, this bill is going to come to the floor of the Senate. It can only be debated for 20 hours. That has the effect of protecting it from a filibuster. And so they developed the process for a different purpose, but one where they thought it would be important to act quickly. So fast forward to the early 1980s. Ronald Reagan gets elected. Republicans have control of one house of Congress for the first time since the early 1950s. Reagan's budget director, David Stockman, sort of knows that these rules exist and thinks they might be really powerful for trying to help accomplish certain goals of the Reagan administration. So that sets off kind of the more modern use of reconciliation. There's a period in the 80s and 90s when deficit reduction was a much more important shared policy goal of both Democrats and Republicans, that the process was actually used for that for a whole bunch of for several years. It sort of allowed everyone to kind of hold hands and jump. Like, no one wanted to be responsible for finding the budget cuts that needed to be made to reduce the deficit. You could use this process to kind of spread the pain around. Starting in 2001, which was when Republicans used the process for the first round of Bush tax cuts, it sort of pivoted to become a little bit of a one neat trick for accomplishing things that majority parties really want to do and don't necessarily have the votes to overcome a filibuster for. So we see tax cuts from Republicans, we see parts of the Affordable Care Act for Democrats, we see the American Rescue Plan, the Inflation Reduction Act, the first Trump tax cuts, and the One Big Beautiful Bill. So we've sort of been living in this era of reconciliation as a partisan tool. What's happened over the last year is an acceleration of something that really started with Democrats in 2021, which is, in addition to the process being a tool for majorities to get things done that are important to them that they can't overcome a filibuster on, both parties have realized that sometimes the thing that they really want to do is spend a bunch of money that historically would have been spent through the bipartisan discretionary appropriations process. So Democrats do this in 2021 when there's a bunch of spending they want to do coming out of COVID that they aren't going to be able to get done in a 50-50 Senate. They do a little bit more of it in the Inflation Reduction Act. Republicans do a whole bunch of it last summer in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. For your defense budget nerd listeners, there's a bunch of defense money in addition to a bunch of immigration enforcement money that was in last summer's bill. And then what's happening right now is that they're sort of Republicans are taking this to its next logical step down the road to I don't know where and saying, okay, we have this one really specific political problem that we cannot solve on a bipartisan basis, which is how to fund immigration enforcement activities at the Department of Homeland Security. We could not get that through on a bipartisan basis. We went through a very long DHS shutdown over it. And so the one avenue available to us to try and turn back on the money spigot for these activities at DHS is to use this partisan process. So this is the first time that a party has said, we're going to do a reconciliation bill just to do something that ordinarily we would do on a bipartisan basis through the appropriations process.
This makes my head explode because for so many reasons, but the primary one is we have had so many shutdowns. We have complained in the executive branch. I have complained in the executive branch, out of the executive branch, sometimes not even agreeing with what is in the budget on the importance of consistent, timely funding, the problems with short-term stopgaps. And all this time, just so we're clear, we could have been using this. And so it seems like perhaps we were not using it for this. And I'll now quote something you said in roll call which the DHS standoff revealed how much of the status quo was sustained by norms and not the rules. So, unpack this.
How let's go back and break the rules.
Yeah, so it's,
if you're going to break the rules, you could break them for like good governance.
Yeah.
So, but I will say that, so first of all, yes, one lesson that we should all be learning right now is that what had really stopped either party from doing a reconciliation bill that was only on discretionary, on spending that we ordinarily handle through the discretionary appropriations process in the past was a really jealous guarding by the appropriators of their own power. And so this idea that, and this actually goes back to Robert Byrd himself. In the 1980s, there were a couple of years where where authorizers started to sort of gesture at the idea that they wanted to do some discretionary spending in the reconciliation process. And Robert Byrd said, absolutely not. Like, that is not your job. It is my job as the top Democrat on the Appropriations Committee. It is our job as appropriators to control this money. That is our power. You cannot have it. And now we've gotten to a point where that kind of jealous guarding by the appropriators of their power has really eroded. I will also note, though, that while I share your deep antipathy for government shutdowns, I'm with you. But as we are sort of watching this process unfold, we are seeing that just because you might be able to get some discretionary spending for DHS done using the reconciliation process does not necessarily mean that's going to be a sort of good government outcome. So one thing we're currently watching unfold again, and we're recording this on Tuesday, is that one of the things that really isn't in the bill text that we've seen for this money for ICE and CBP is a lot of the language that's usually in a discretionary appropriations bill that really is meant to cabin the way the executive branch spends this money. So, listeners will know about various policy riders that generally accompany this spending in discretionary appropriations bills. We don't know for sure kind of how this will shake out, but that wasn't in the original text that the Senate committees released. And so it's one possibility here is that there's just a whole bunch of money that goes to DHS for these activities. But because this is the process that is being used for it, it does not carry a lot of the other guidance and restrictions that Congress has for many years placed on this funding because of the way that it's getting done. And I would offer that that's also not a good government outcome. And for people who care about congressional power, which I am one deeply, it's also not something that I think we should be excited about.
So let's go down to the bad place for a minute, keep going down to the bad place in terms of
Lauren, this is the place.
We are in the bad place, but we're going to keep going further. That is fast. That is really interesting because that is one of those appropriations, one of those last few places that if they want it to, it has teeth in some way. So I would love, Molly, if you kind of continue down to the bad place with this, what are some of the further consequences that we might see of this? We have opened this door. And then with it, I saw Chris Murphy talking about how Democrats are going to try to use this in the future, how Republicans might. How might we see, what are the consequences, and also how might we see the various parties try to continue to use this in the future? Or have they touched the stove and been oh, okay, maybe never mind.
There's a lot of uncertainty. So one possibility is that we are headed for a world where when there is unified party control, so when one party controls the House, the Senate, and the White House, Congress does some discretionary appropriations bills that flow through the appropriations committees for all of the things that can get bipartisan support and where people are excited to work on a bipartisan basis for things where there's sort of broad agreement. And then there's a second process that is reserved for the things that are really important to the majority party that they can't get done through that discretionary appropriations process. So it really bifurcates the process of appropriating into two groups. And that also, again, is, people who are interested in the defense budget, creates its own kinds of the same sort of uncertainty that the Defense Department hates in the direction of CRs, because you don't know. You don't know which of those worlds you're going to live in. We know that, when you just have like one big open-ended appropriation for something, it makes it gives it, you have different challenges about how to plan for that spending. So that's sort of one possibility. Another possibility is, to your point, is that they sort of touch the stove here and they realize that actually, trying to spend money for regular agency operations on a multi-year basis without the same kind of guidance from Congress, that Congress doesn't actually like that. I don't really know which one of those two things is more likely. The third possibility, and I think that eventually we're going to live in this world, and the question is just when do we get there, is that at some point one party, when they have unified party control, is going to get rid of the legislative filibuster. Like I firmly believe we're sort of on the long, slow march to that future state. And so at that point, some of this question of like, do we have two parallel processes and what gets handled in one and what gets handled in the other? And are there funding streams that go back and forth between the two? And what happens if you try to fund some activities in an agency through the discretionary process and some through the mandatory process? And then like, does the money all get commingled on the back end? And now we're in parts of budget execution world that I don't really understand. So all of this there's a lot of uncertainty. And even if it solves short-term political problems, which is really how I see what's happening right now, it doesn't necessarily take us to a place where the process of deciding how to allocate precious federal resources is being done in a more coherent, consistent, predictable way.
I have one comment, then I'll give it to Rada to close out the last question. And like, as you were talking about like these two lanes and two funding streams here, one thing I thought about, Rada, is the Pentagon's unfunded requirements process, which by the way is a ridiculous process where like the Pentagon comes up with its own budget and then COCOMs and service secretaries, commanders and service secretaries get to say, hey, actually here's some additional requirements, which is
only
insane.
the military.
Only military that are unfunded that we get to send direct to Congress with no oversight by the Secretary of Defense, who is understandably like WTF continuously. But it's almost like a version of this where you have like, here's our normal process. And then we have this is our special pot of money that we use to do for like the special things over here. And like, that doesn't actually make sense, but we have, I don't want to say lived with it at the department. We have manipulated it at the department to a quite fascinating extent. Sorry, Rada, go ahead.
No, well, I think that dovetails into what I was saying, which is like, there's just a whole other episode to be had on how these processes really screw up the budget execution side of things.
All right, yeah.
Because it turns out to execute the budget, you need to do things like write contracts. And those contracts have to follow processes that need to withstand legal scrutiny. And so even if you solve the congressional side, you have the courts, the private sector, to navigate, right? And there are competitive interests on that side that I will just elide over now to take us into closing here, but which is, so we're in the bad place. We want to get back to the good place. Are there procedural reforms that could or should be considered, any of them under serious consideration, that would help us make this congressional processes healthier? Like how do we get to the good place? Molly, tell us.
Yeah. So I'll say two things. One is ironically, so one of the things that you often hear people who want a better budget process call for is a return to the quote unquote regular order, which is to say that Congress should go back to the days when it considered 12 appropriations bills separately, one at a time. That is sort of that would make this all work better. I will remind folks that actually part of how we got to where we are right now is that they finished everything else, and then they had Democrats had sort of forced the cleaving off of the DHS bill to stand alone by itself, and then the Republicans and Democrats couldn't come to a deal to pass it, and then there was a really long shutdown, and now we're in this sort of hybrid discretionary mandatory reconciliation world. And I say that because I think it's an important reminder that in our current political moment, there will be unintended consequences of trying to use our old processes in the way that we might have used them 30 years ago. That we really need to focus on things that kind of meet our politics where they are. It's why I have never been a person who's been super worked up about the use of omnibus bills at the end of the process. So as long as sort of the construction of the individual bills is deliberative and runs through the appropriations committees and their subcommittees, if what it takes to get it done at the end of the day is one giant log roll across all of the issues, that's never really worked me up that much. In terms of what do I think we need to do, I actually think it's not, and I say this as someone who has made their career explaining congressional procedure to people, I actually don't think it's fundamentally about the procedures themselves. The rules aren't magic. They can't force members to do things that they don't want to do in the first place. And so what we have to do is convince members that they actually should care about their own power, and convince the appropriators that giving up their power to the authorizers just because it solves a political problem is actually not good for anyone in the long run. So it's really a question of how do you convince members that their own power in the institution and then collectively as a branch of government is important and worth fighting for.
Man, I so appreciate your last points. And also, I want to go back to like 10 years ago me and say that the appropriators have given up power to the authorizers, and like just watch like the fits that I go through. Like, what? Like, what is happening here? Anyway, Molly, this has been in the full spectrum of delightful, highly educational, extremely disturbing, all the things at once. Exactly what we want our interviews to be. So
that's my specialty.
That's
all of those things at once.
Thank you so much. Next time we have an insane congressional crisis of some kind, we'll have you back on. So, probably next week or so.
Always happy to join.
Fantastic. All right. So appreciate it. Thank you. So for Gong Show, we were going to talk about Devil Wears Prada, but Radha is going to see it like literally now. So instead of us discussing it, I want to give her a little bit of homework.
Excellent.
So my first bit of homework is, has Anne Hathaway had work done since the movie?
Oh.
Yep. Or is it just creative hairstyling, which it could very well be.
I know that is her assertion, and she has his little braid she claims, but I'm going to look. This is good.
Yeah. Because it's not, it's both the cheekbones and the eyes and stuff like that, but also just like she's had an amazing set of facials no matter what has happened. Definitely.
I know. I want to ask celebrities about their lasers because, I mean, it can't just be, it's not just that their skin is tighter, right? It's like the texture is so good. Okay.
Yes, it's incredible. Two, it is definitely a darker vibe of the prior show for any number of reasons. And I'm curious if like you are able to get the joy out of it that like one would want to get out of this. And three, I have lots of feelings about how they end up resolving any number of tensions. Like, so at the end of the last movie, it is not really clear. Like, people end up like in somewhat positive places, but like Emily and Andy are like not exactly friends. They're okay, but they're not exactly friends. Andy and Miranda, like, kind of end on an okay note, but not exactly. Like, it's not clear she's ever actually going to notice her again. And Miranda and, oh my gosh, who does Stanley Tucci play? Stanley Tucci. Miranda and Stanley Tucci, she has royally screwed him over. And like now they're all back in together in this space. And like, they address this in the movie, but like there's so many layers to this, and I'm very excited to get your take on like how they resolve these tensions. And also, is this just like a part of growing up where we are like you just recognize that you have weird moments with friends and colleagues and stuff like that and you move on? Or is this like, oh, actually, no, that's not great? So I'm very curious how you think about all these things.
Oh my gosh. Well, that feels like one, a lot of homework, and two, strong signal that I should drink some rosé while I watch it.
You absolutely need rosé while you're watching this. No question in my mind.
Excellent. All right. Well, we'll report back when next we meet.
Awesome. All right. Next time, everyone. We'll see you then.
Bye.